Hi, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumSpes22.com, Podbean podcast and YouTube video. Very happy to be back in the saddle, back from Rome. Been back now about a week, but super busy on the farm. Very, very, very busy. But podcasts are coming along now, and happy to be back in the saddle, and very happy to be joined today by a repeat victim of the podcast. I believe this might be your third appearance on the podcast,
Perhaps.
Monsignor Heintz. So let me just read this out so to refamiliarize the audience with who you are. Monsignor Micheal Heintz is a priest of the Diocese of Fort Wayne, South Bend, and is pastor of St. Pius X Parish in Granger, where I stayed last fall with my beautiful wife, thanks to you.
And where you're
He,
welcome to stay again this November.
well, we'll talk about that.
Yeah,
He now serves as visiting director of the Mart is it pronounced Martin?
Martin. Yes.
Martin program in homiletics and liturgics at Notre Dame. He's a graduate of Notre Dame, got his PhD there in 2008, and for 6 years was director of the Master of Divinity program in the Theology department there, 2010, 2016. And for 8 years, and this is where he first crossed my radar. 8 years he taught at Mount St. Mary's Seminary, my alma mater in Emmitsburg, Maryland, where he served as dean. His research interests include Latin and Greek patristics, as well as the thought of ressourcement thinkers such as Louis Bouillet and Jean Danielou. He serves on the editorial board of the Fathers of the Church series from COA Press and also serves as a consultant to the USCCB's Committee on Doctrine, among other things, I'm sure. So you are a busy man. I mean, just being pastor is busy enough, right?
No, I enjoy it very much. I like being busy, and I like pastoral life.
That's good. So we have limited time today because Father has to run off. This is Ascension Thursday and say Mass at I believe 6 p.m. our
Hmm.
time, so it's 5 p.m. here. So we do need to get right into it. Our topic of today is homiletics, preaching, fancy preaching. All
Hmm.
right, and he is a director of a program that looks into that. And I think this is a very, very important topic. And when I was in Rome and you suggested it to me, I immediately said, yes, let's absolutely do this. Let's look into it. But before we get to that, before we get to the main topic of the day, I have to simply ask you, what are your initial thoughts on our new Holy Father, Pope Leo the 14th? I'll just say my thoughts are overwhelmingly positive right now. I really like the new Holy Father, but what are your thoughts?
I share your joy. He strikes me again. It's just been a couple of weeks, but what really was remarkable was, and it's not particular to him necessarily, the whole process of the funeral of Pope Francis, the conclave, the build up, the experience of it. It brought a lot of attention to Catholicism in a good way. And people
Yes.
who might be Catholic and lapsed or just interested on the outside, I think it heightened interest. And really, the whole thing was beautiful. The mass, the inaugural mass, was
Yeah.
magnificent. And again, it's part of the way the church evangelizes. I think the beautiful, rich tradition that we offer and participate in as Catholics is fantastic. I
And
mean, he strikes me as unassuming. He was apparently a White Sox fan. There was a great debate as to whether he was a Cubs fan or a White Sox fan. Cubs fans will tell you that, well, he was a White Sox fan, but that was prior to infallibility attaching. So,
yeah, and I was so privileged to actually be there at St. Peter's in the square when his name was announced and waiting, saw the black smoke for a day and white smoke. And the white smoke came so quickly, we all thought it was going to be Cardinal Parolin. And so when they called Cardinal Prevost, I thought, oh my goodness, they've elected an American. But I agree with you about the evangelization. I had an article came out last week, maybe 2 weeks now, in Catholic World Report, in which I pointed out, irrespective of whether or not you were happy with this election, this guy or not, the sheer spectacle, the sheer theodrama of what takes place is in a Catholic conclave, and so is unparalleled for any institution in the world. When you're standing there, and the way that the cardinals communicate to the outside world is through a tiny little chimney
Yeah.
coming out of the Sistine Chapel, black or white smoke, surrounded by Renaissance and Baroque architecture, with these princes of the church sequestered in a secret meeting and so on. There's just no other intrigue in the world quite like it, and there has this powerful, powerful sort of pull, I think, for a lot of
It's
people.
it all of this helps to shape a Catholic imagination. We had the principal of the grade school. I have 700 children in the grade school here, and they had all the faculty on alert. If there's white smoke, we're all going to turn the televisions on. We have some where the teachers took a video of the second grade children jumping up and down and cheering as the new Holy Father came out. They don't know who he is, but they're just excited because they're Catholic, and we have a Pope, and they were thrilled. And I thought these kids are going to remember exactly where they were on this day the rest of their life.
Oh, absolutely. And it's so true. It's just the idea we have a new pope. I wrote in my article there were these two Filipino sisters right next to me on the square near the obelisk. And as soon as Prevost's name was announced, they were jumping up and down with joy and screaming and tears, literally tears coming out of their eyes, and they were waving a little papal flag. And when the hoopla died out, I turned to the one sister and I said, "Oh, so you must know about what do you know about Cardinal Prevost?" And she said, "Who?" In other words, she didn't know who the new pope was at all. She was just
Exactly.
happy. Oh my God, we have a pope. That's
Yes.
fantastic.
Yes.
So anyway, that's great. I think we all have great hopes for what is hopefully a long, healthy, and productive pontificate from Robert Francis Prevost, Pope Leo the 14th. Anyway, on to homiletics.
Mhm.
So I'm going to let you lead into the topic because I have a lot that I would want to say, most of it negative about about the quality of homiletics, and so I don't want to start off with something negative necessarily. I want you to why are you focused on this? What's so important about this?
Well, the position I hold is a program and a chair founded by the late John and Virginia Martin, and they have a number of children. And many years ago, they were concerned about the quality of preaching, especially in the Catholic world. And so they founded a program and endowed it, and their children continue to be benefactors and supporters of this to try to strengthen and improve the quality of Catholic preaching. Um, and preaching beyond Catholicism as well, obviously. I think um, I think the challenge of preaching is that it takes both time and preparation, which many clergy don't think they have or often don't have a lot of. It also demands, I think, of all of us a real prayer life. And, there's no direct correlation between that was not a very good homily and this is just someone who doesn't pray. But I do think that if preachers are invested in their prayer life and do take the time to prepare and also learn, ask for feedback. There are parishioners that I will ask for feedback after a particular weekend or something. Hey, did that work or did it not work? And sometimes I'll adjust between masses when I realize that that didn't work. I want to tone, settle this part down and highlight this. And so it's an art, not a science. And it's in many ways it is dialogical. Conversing with other preachers. What are you doing this weekend with this set of readings that were given? One of the beautiful things about Catholicism is that we don't pick the readings. We'd all gravitate toward the things we like, and we're presented with readings, and that makes demands on us, and it should, rightly so. I'm always delighted when wedding couples, for example, in selecting readings for their wedding, don't choose 1 Corinthians 12:31 to 13. Love is patient, not because it's not a beautiful reading, but for so many years, that's all I heard every Saturday. And it loses its beauty when it becomes so familiar. And so, and I like being perhaps stretched to preach on something I hadn't thought about preaching before at a wedding. Here's a reading that I hadn't thought of before or used before. Wow, this is great. And so it's demanding, but it's also really good for the health of preaching, I think, to be stretched.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head with regard to, a priest, number one, has to make time. I like to, we'll talk about the prayer and the learning in a second. Well, I want to talk about learning first. I mean, there's an old Latin phrase, nemo dat quod non habet. You can't give what
Absolutely.
you don't have. And I think one of the problems with the modern day priesthood in general is that priests are stretched so thin because there are so few of you, and some pastors are pastors of two parishes,
or
sometimes three.
three or five worship sites, whatever they call it exactly.
Yeah, so I'm not here to tear down priests, not at all. I know too many really good ones who work their fingers to the bones. But I think often they do lose sight of the fact that for millions of Catholics, okay, that Sunday homily is their only exposure to evangelization and or catechetics ever at any time in their lives, and therefore how unbelievably important it is, and therefore how important it is for the priest to actually have something to say. And that's only going to happen if you read, okay, and you ponder and you pray about your reading and so on. And so I know priests are busy, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what can a priest do who is a pastor, who has all of these people? I'm not, in other words, I'm not trying to impute ill will toward,
No, no, no.
like, oh, who cares about the homily? And no, these are genuinely busy human beings who are exhausted, and they're going to say, "I don't have time to read. I don't have time to pray about the reading I'm doing, and so I'm just going to wing a homily or whatever." So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right. Many priests are busy. I would also say this. This is true of every single one of us. This isn't just unique to priests or clergy. All of us actually have more time than we realize because all of us squander time in the course of the day in small pieces, but cumulatively, it's a lot of wasted time doing what? Scrolling on the phone, looking at
Oh
baseball
yeah,
scores, reading blogs. None of those things are bad, but we think, oh, I've only got 20 minutes, so I'll do this instead of using. And I'm as guilty as anyone, so I really am working to discipline myself because I squander too much time looking at screens, for example. So I think part of the issue is if we all did a time study and we're really honest with ourselves, we do have more time than we think we do. We just need to be more intentional about it and self-disciplined about it to set time aside. I really try as a habit, and I encourage my students for years, like to begin at least on Monday, looking at the set of readings and the prayers appointed for the coming week, because actually there's a mutual relationship between the sets of prayers that are chosen and the readings that the church appoints. Sometimes it's very obvious and direct. Other times it's perhaps mysterious to us. But to pay attention to that, and usually on Monday, I don't have a clue what I'm going to do on Sunday's homily, you know, but praying through those readings in the course of the week, and every priest has multiple registers at work at the same time. So I'm thinking about Sunday's homily. I've got a daily mass homily today. I have a funeral tomorrow. I have a wedding on Saturday. I'm trying to keep all of those, and I actually believe that those different registers actually mutually inform one another. They actually strengthen one another by doing that. Because it's strength, it's expanding my exposure to scripture, among other things, which is never a bad thing. This idea that
right.
we're given appointed four texts to preach on, usually an Old Testament reading, Psalm, letter, gospel, and that's all we can ever talk about that week is absurd. All of the scriptures belong to the church. And in fact, if a passage from Luke helps to unpack this passage from Mark, we should feel no compunction in actually drawing from it and using that to help explain the scriptures and to unpack them for people. No one's going to write you a citation, say, I'm sorry, it's here, see, you shouldn't have done that or whatever. So I think we have a lot of and devote time every day. And really, if even part of daily prayer is given to, I wouldn't call it. If you simply utilize prayer as a homily prep time, that's not good. But if your prayer is feeding your homiletic preparation, that's not a bad thing, and it should be something that feeds our thinking about what we're going to preach about. So I think prayer is absolutely essential, but time is also a piece of it. If waiting till Saturday at 4 o'clock to start thinking what I'm going to talk about an hour is malpractice. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. It's just we should never ever do that.
Uh, I once, speaking of Mount St. Mary's, I mean, the fact is that every once in a while, a priest probably is going to have to, based on events of a week, get to a 4 p.m. on a Saturday and say, "Holy cow, I had just have not had time to pray a homily," and you're going to be up against. I ran in when I was a seminarian at the Mount. I ran into Monsignor John Quinn. I don't know if you remember Monsignor
Famous
Quinn.
Monsignor, a personal friend of Louis Bouillet.
Yes, and a liturgy professor there.
Mhm.
He
And
kind of
also
looked
done
like
Woody at a point and everything else. Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock, and he smoked cigars. And I was rushing back from somewhere because I was late for his class. And as I was getting to McSweeney Hall, he was standing outside smoking a cigar, and class was about to start. And I said, Monsignor, wait, you aren't, don't you have to go teach? He goes, yeah, yes, yes, oh, Larry, my, yes. I said, are you even ready? And he goes, well, he goes, Larry, the proximate preparation is indeed scanty, but the remote preparation, oh, Larry, that is enormous. And and so my point would be with regard to the rushed priest, if you occasionally do have to rush, hopefully your remote preparation is so enormous that you have resources to draw upon, and that's sort of the point here.
That's absolutely true. And someone like Quinn had enormous resources on which to draw. But I think you pointed earlier about the point of reading. Um, I always have encouraged students in, well, for ministry generally, but certainly specifically for preaching, they should always be reading something. Uh, Not just theology or biblical sciences, but those things too. Novels, poetry. The more exposure we have to human experiences that aren't
That's
mine
right.
and can't be mine, allows me to grow in empathy for people who are different from myself, and therefore I can actually preach to them better when I read a novel about someone whose life experience was very different from my own, but you can, through a good novel, get inside that person, so to speak, and understand them in a way that you wouldn't apart from that. So it's not just reading novels, it's reading broadly, but to be reading something. I once heard a priest say many years ago, I haven't read a book since the seminary, and I wanted to say, well, it's quite evident from your preaching. Now, I didn't say
Yeah.
that, but it was evident. You
But
run. We need grist for a prayer, and we also need it for preaching to be fed and to be nourished so that we have something to be thinking and praying about. And
yeah,
so that kind of nourishment, and again, it doesn't have to be reading a heavy theological tome, though that's no bad thing either. But it's also just feeding the mind and the soul with that which can help us as disciples, because we're first hearers of the word. We're first disciples long
yes,
before we're preachers. And if I'm not receiving nourishment, I'm I'm not going to be able to impart nourishment or much of anything to people. And so I think that you're
yes,
quite right. And preachers, and I have this, if I knew what it was immediately, I wouldn't probably do it. All preachers have sort of themes or ideas or go-to moves or topics that are dear to them and important to them. That's just human nature. It's no problem. But if
yeah,
you're not aware of it, your homily becomes the same thing every week. Or here we go
yeah,
again. Your father's going to circle back to this again. And so it's good to have people who can be frank with you, who hear you, to give you feedback. To
yeah,
say, like,
yeah,
you kind of talked about this last, and it's like you're not always aware of it. It's like, oh, you're right, I have done that. I've got to be aware of
yeah.
that. I think
Yeah,
everyone has.
I once had a pastor who had been in the army for many years before becoming a priest, and
Mhm,
every single one of his homilies referenced his army days, and
mhm.
sort of recycling the same stories. So I finally did kind of say something to him. I won't mention his name. He was a great pastor, actually, and I said, maybe enough of the army stories,
And
something
he
else
probably
here.
wasn't even aware it was so.
No, he wasn't. He was,
Yeah, yeah,
oh, Larry, thank you so much.
yeah.
He goes, oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, I just fall back on that because that's so much a part of
And,
who I
that's
am.
every single one of us who preaches. It's not
That's right.
particular to a
Well,
generation.
me as a teacher and me as a blogger. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a same stupid hobby horses over. And it's human nature.
That's why reading broadly
Oh,
helps
yeah.
overcome that.
Yes. So I want to come back to my seminary experience at the Mount.
Mhm.
And I don't want to mention any names because he was a wonderful priest, but our homiletics professor, this was back in the mid 80s, telling us the classic thing from that period was you don't give people theology in your homily because that turns them off and it's too deep for them anyway. You should begin your homily with some kind of a story of some kind. You should never write out your homily. And the homily should simply be short and leave people with something, some takeaway, usually that comes out of the story or whatever that is in some ways related to the scripture of the day. Uh, I remember thinking as a seminarian, I don't like that idea. Right. So maybe you could, you know
Yeah,
how common that was back in the day.
sure. Again, I think I would gently push back on all of those claims. I think that we actually are to be, the theology of the church is rich and beautiful.
Yes.
How it is communicated and explained to people in a homily is what matters. So we are to be imparting the mysteries of the faith and speaking in a way that encourages affection, reverence, and love for the church and for its tradition. But you can't simply just start reading out of the Summa, for example, or no, it's a matter. So I'm a big believer that it's important to introduce your hearers to the theological lexicon of the church, the
Yes.
scriptural idiom certainly, but also terms that are part of our tradition. So I'm not afraid to use the term concupiscence in a homily, but I never assume anyone knows what it means. So I might use it and say, this is a term that the tradition uses
Right.
about moral feebleness. So they're walking home with a new vocabulary where they've learned from the tradition and also understanding it. So I think it's you
Yeah.
don't it's not that you avoid those kind of that vocabulary, but you have to explain it and understand and unpack for people. So also, we can't, there's not everything can be catechized from in a homily in a pulpit. I'm a big believer in my priesthood. I've always used the bulletin, parish bulletin, as a way of teaching because I can't possibly address every topic and every issue from the
Right.
pulpit because then you just become the guy who's always talking about his hobby horse political or theological agenda. But you can, and people seem to read it, something in the bulletin each week about that I use to. So if there's something that needs to be talked about catechetically, I'm not forced to try to hamstring my homily to make it work. I can
Yeah.
do that in another venue and actually spend time preaching the word. So I think theology it should be theological. That doesn't mean abstruse or too abstract, but good theology is not abstract or abstruse. The word became flesh, and we have a
Yeah.
narrative that unpacks that. Um, in terms of the story, I'm always a little wary of starting. Every good homily needs a hook. I get that. Like, in other words, the thing
That's
you're going to
true.
get at the beginning. I'm wary of stories, especially stories about myself, only because people are endlessly curious about their priests. And if I start with a story about myself, that might derail their paying attention to almost anything else I'm going to say. So that having used a story to talk about something, I'm not opposed to it, but it has to be done very judiciously and selectively. Uh, but and in fact, what you'll have is people coming out of church saying, "Father, I had no idea your sister liked popcorn." And that was the takeaway from the homily was some
Yeah.
element of the story which is insignificant to the point you wanted to make. So what they remember is your story and nothing about Jesus, you know? So you have to be very judicious in the use of stories, especially about ourselves. It's not that we're not self-revealing in an appropriate way. It's just that it isn't about us. And I find a more effective hook is to say something provocative that's going to perk their ears up and then unpack it for them to, I said once at the beginning of a homily, I said, like, the most dangerous thing a Catholic can think is that their faith is the most important part of their life. And I paused and I repeated it. And then I said, because our faith isn't a part of our life.
That's
It's
right.
it's the milieu of all of our, like, it isn't part of our life. And if we've done that, we become secular because we've compartmentalized our faith, put it in a silo. And even if we call it the most important part, guess what? We've domesticated it and it's over here. And so there's ways of saying provocative things. The best homily I ever gave to school children was totally unplanned. It was Lazarus and the Rich Man. And when I preach to children to school mass, I'll come down and ask them questions usually. And it was like third, fourth, fifth, sixth graders. And I came out of the pulpit and I said, what happens when we ignore the poor? And one little girl raised her hand and she said, we go to hell. And I turned around and went and sat down because you know what? That was more eloquent than anything else I could have said. And they'll remember that the rest of their lives, you know? Uh,
That's
and
fantastic.
that wasn't a
Yeah.
plant. I fully
Yeah.
expected to say Jesus, because that's usually the first
Yeah.
answer any kid gives, is Jesus.
That's
So
so true. Oh, go ahead.
I think the use of stories can be effective, but I think there's other ways of getting people hooked. I think priests will often use stories as a hook, as a way of engaging, but people actually are hungry to be fed. And
Yeah.
I think that we often aim too low in our preaching rather than too high.
Bingo.
Like,
Bingo.
we assume they can't understand or don't know anything. And so again, it's not that we should try to preach, you know, abstract theological concepts. We can deliver the same thing in a way that's intelligible.
Yeah.
And I think we aim too low, not too high.
especially in many of our large American suburban parishes, you're dealing with a very educated laity, and
Mhm.
they're comparing a college level knowledge of all these other subjects, and then they're getting Dick and Jane, let us be nice to the nice
Well,
homilies,
and then moralizing, which is the go-to move
moralizing.
in
But you're
Catholic
so
preaching.
true about stories about yourself. I mean, when I was a deacon, I once told a story about being on a roller coaster as a deacon with a youth group, and there was this little boy that I took on the roller, and I'm afraid of roller coasters. And this little boy only had one arm. He was born with one arm. And I turned to him and I said, Wally, I'm really kind of scared of roller coasters. And he reached up with his one good arm and he grabbed me. He says, don't worry, Deacon, I have a hold of you. I thought, well, this is going to be a great homily story right here. Uh, I began with that, and then I went on from that to talk about trust and faith and things like that. When I walked out, and as people, all they wanted to talk about was, why are you afraid of roller
Yeah,
coasters?
exactly. Yeah. But
Oh,
that's the we they're very curious about us, and so any of
yeah,
that kind of self-revealing stuff is interesting to them, and they're going to gravitate toward that and forget the point you wanted to make about the gospel.
yeah, and that's just so true. But what about that other point? I know it's kind of controversial, but I mean, just based on my very limited experience as a deacon, I'm a laicized deacon, right? Everybody knows that now. I wrote my homilies out, and in one sense, it's bad if you don't know how to read a text properly to an
Mhm.
audience that is still very engaging and animated, and you have to be able to do that. But in a sense, it's good because then you've got that homily in your file. And so after you've been a priest like 10 years, you've hopefully built up this massive set of written out homilies. So you're not going to preach on the same thing over and over, but you're not going to have to reinvent the homily for
Mhm.
every funeral that comes down the pike, every marriage that comes down the pike. You're going to have maybe a stockpile of 5 or 6 homilies on that particular set of scripture. So what do you think about writing out homilies?
When I teach homiletics, I almost insist that they begin with the text. Now, homily preaching is not reading to people. So
Right.
it's not reading to people. It's actually it's speaking to people, proclaiming. And so the text is meant to help you stay on task. My first 5 years or so of my preaching, I always had a text. And then today, I don't preach with a text. And that isn't something I encourage people to start with. Certain really gifted people can begin that way. That's wonderful. I did not have that capacity.
Yeah.
I began using a text. The benefit of a text is it disciplines you to think and to write out what you want to say and in the
Right.
order you want to say it. One of the best priests and preachers I know, uh, my predecessor in this parish, who's 77 years old, still to this day has a text for every homily he delivers. He will write it out. Now, he
Yeah.
doesn't read it to people, but that disciplines him
Yeah.
to be thoughtful about what he wants to say. I will from time to time use a text if the homily, it could be at a funeral or something else, which sensitivity is really important so that I don't accidentally turn a phrase in a way that could be hurtful or heard as hurtful. So that way I've got a record too of what I've said. Because I want to be very careful. If certain situations pastorally are very difficult, and so I think having something written then is not ill-advised.
Yeah.
And I look back at the homilies I gave my first 3, 4 years of priest. I look at them like now, like, ugh, what was I thinking? And the beautiful thing about preaching is that we have a cycle that repeats the 3-year cycle on Sundays. The weekday cycles, well, the first reading is different every year, going back and forth between the 2 years. And I don't always remember what I did 2 years ago on Tuesday, the 13th week of the year. But if you pray the scriptures and read them prayerfully, they're living. And so you're going to get something from the Lord because he's still speaking. That's what inspiration means. He's speaking to us now
Yeah.
in and through
Yeah.
these texts.
And
And
that's
so
important.
to trust that and to trust that the Lord's going to give me what I need. One of my simple prayers in preparation for preaching is give me the words. Like, what am I supposed to say?
Give me the
And,
words.
Dami verbum, verba, Domine, give me the words, Lord. That doesn't mean I just say that and then shoot from the hip when I get to the pulpit. I've never spoken in church unprepared. One morning many years ago, it was early, and there was an outside priest who was supposed to take the dawn mass at the parish I was in, and I was in the office working early, and our sexton came in and said, "Hey, Father so and so didn't show up." And I was not scheduled to mass that evening. I hadn't a homily ready yet. So I went over, celebrated mass, but I did not preach. I sat down. And people afterwards said, like, well, why didn't you preach? I said, because I had nothing prepared.
Yeah.
I'm simply not, I
Right.
will not speak if I haven't at least given some thought or prayer to it. And at that point, I hadn't. So I'm happy to celebrate the Mass. I don't like the fact that I really believe daily preaching is really important, not just for the people of God, but for the preacher. The discipline of preaching
Yeah.
daily. I think the temptation for priests who preach regularly and daily is to, oh, I don't know, I'm tired. I don't know what to say, so I'm just going to skip the homily. Um, that's unfortunate because it's as important for the priest or deacon as it is for the person in the pew because that we're still hearers of the word first and we need to
Yeah.
assimilate what's being said by the Lord to us in a way that it has an impact on our own life. That said, I also very much believe that, especially if it's been 3 or 4 months of preaching daily, funerals, weddings, Sunday masses, um, and you just haven't had any breaks, to when you take a retreat or vacation, certainly celebrate Mass every day, but don't preach for a week. It's a marvelous reboot. So when I come back from vacation, for example, I'll celebrate Mass, of course, but I don't preach. And it gives me, I come back on fire to preach with all kinds of ideas and thoughts. And because I've prayed
Yeah.
during that time, but I've not been thinking about preaching for a week. So I think there's a value to unplugging for a few days and then plugging back in as well.
Oh, I think that's so true. I remember when I was first a university professor, I began by having very detailed lecture notes. And that went on for a couple of years. But by the time I was a fifth year professor, I was teaching without lecture notes.
Mhm.
You know, here's the topic of the day. Okay, I know that topic. And then in my head, I would say, okay,
And
then
that
boom.
was Monsignor Quinn's point. You know,
Yeah. Yes.
the
Yes.
material, he's assimilated the material. I taught Christology at the seminary for 8
Yes.
years. And after about 4 years, I knew what I was going to do every day in class. I mean, I could
Yeah.
glance at some notes, but it wasn't that I was making anything up. It was that I had so assimilated what I wanted to do, and I'd workshopped it to the point where I knew how it worked and how I could do it well, that it just happened. And that's lots of work that goes in. That didn't just, no one starts there, you know.
Yeah. But all of this points to, and maybe you address this in the program that you work with there at Notre Dame, the need, I think, for a couple of things, for fraternity amongst priests. So many
Absolutely.
parish priests are so isolated right now.
Mhm.
You know, back in the day, you might have two other priests, sometimes three in the parish, in the rectory with you. And now priests are by themselves.
Mhm.
So you need fraternity of priests in order to help one another preach better,
Absolutely.
help one another become better homilists. And then the other thing it seems to me is that priests have to, like you said, recharge their batteries. They have to be able to, and not only that, to have ongoing education for the diocese to provide them with
Mhm.
opportunities for retreats and ongoing education.
Yeah, I agree fully. I think I know priests who, well, when I lived my first assignment, I lived with three other priests. There were four of us together. But in the last few years, when I was a pastor, I always had a parochial vicar. And it was not uncommon for me to touch base early in the week. Hey, what are you going to do this weekend with the readings? Or what did you think about, the second reading this
Right.
week? And that just conversation both holds us both accountable to prepare, but also we learn from each other. Sometimes we did very different things. Sometimes our homilies followed similar tracks. There's no right or wrong there. It's that we were actually intentional about thinking about it. I encourage one of the challenges for all, and I work mostly with young priests because I'm an older priest now, is to be intentional about such things. A lot of young men will think, man, it would be really great if I could get together with some brothers and we could talk about the readings. We'll make it happen. Like, don't just think
Yeah.
about it happening. You actually have to make choices to be intentional and organized enough to think far enough out to say, hey, maybe we could grab coffee on Tuesday and we could all talk about the
Or
coming weekend's
even
readings.
if you're all super busy, do Zoom,
Zoom,
do
yeah.
this.
Well, I know another pastor who, this is beautiful. Every Thursday morning, he has a Bible study in the parish, and the study is over this coming Sunday's readings. So by Thursday, he must have done all the pick and shovel work to be able to answer questions and explain the
Great
context of the
idea.
readings, so that by Thursday, all that's done. Because they're going to ask him questions, he's got to have it done by then. So that then again, that's not preaching is not exegesis. The temptation is to get up there and say, like, well, the Greek word behind this is, and that can be helpful, but often, you know, the
In
first
this
paragraph of Dei
pericope,
Verbum
what Luke, yeah,
12, the first
yeah,
paragraph of Dei Verbum 12 is really important. The second is no less important, and it explicitly says so. That is to say, not just attention to the the historical literary context, but also the narrative unity, the divine authorship, the analogy of faith. No less attention should be paid to those things. I'm not at all criticizing the pick and shovel historical critical work that we all need to have done to understand the readings as the author intended them. But God uses the author's words often for his own purposes. And scripture speaks now, not just then, to people. And so to pay attention to all those things is really important in preaching as well. But not simply to get up and say, like, I read a great commentary. Okay, that's like a book report. That's not preaching.
Yeah. Then you have priests, and I want to, before we get out of here, and we have to leave, you have to leave in like 10 minutes here, 10
Mhm.
or 15. I do want to talk about what it is that you do in your program and who goes there and why and
Mhm.
so forth. But before we get to that, uh, geez, I just lost my train. I thought I was going to ask you about something about the audience.
Mhm.
The nature of the audience before you, if you want to
Mhm.
call them that, has to constantly be on your. I was aware of that as a teacher as well. I mean, there's the parable of the sower and the seed, and you're throwing these seeds out there, and some's on rocky soil, some's on fertile soil, or whatever. So what I like to say often is that the laity get the clergy that they deserve. And so if you have a laity that don't give a darn about the scriptures, they don't care really that much about the things of the faith, they're at church for a variety of reasons that don't run too deep, uh, then in a sense, that's going to wear down a priest over time.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering if there isn't, well, we're so focused in terms of improving homiletics, we're so focused on the priest. I wonder sometimes if we don't need also to train our attention on the laity and the responsibility that lay people have to prepare themselves to
Mhm.
hear the word preached properly.
That's a very good point. I would first comment that I really don't think there's any such thing as generic preaching. That's impossible. Um, when I was first at the Mount, first couple of weekends, I was asked to cover multiple parishes, bouncing around Baltimore, Harrisburg, all over, filling in, which I was happy to celebrate Mass at the parish on the weekend. But it's almost impossible to preach to people you've never met before. Oh, I
Yes.
could give them a homily, but actually preaching is dialogical insofar as I know my congregation, I know my assembly, my people, and I know what their needs are. I know where they're at. I know their struggles. I know their challenges. I know their hopes. I know, and that makes preaching all the more real and better. But getting, sort of a canned homily to a group of people you've never met before, you do the best you can, but you could miss entirely where they're at, and it'd be very ineffective because they just, you know.
It's very interesting. When I was a deacon one time, after I got done preaching, I had a lady come up to me and say, Deacon Chapp, I felt like you were talking directly to
Mhm.
me in that homily. And I looked
Mhm.
at her, and her name was Ethel. I said, Ethel, I was talking to you.
Mhm.
And I geared my entire homily around a conversation you and I had like a month ago about something. She goes, "Really?" I said, "Yeah." I said, because I thought it was pertinent to the whole congregation, but I was really talking to you.
Yes, I was very blessed. So after those first couple of weeks, I was connected with a parish in Northern Virginia, St. John the Apostle in Leesburg.
I know it
So
well, yeah.
I would go there every weekend and help out with confessions and mass. I loved it because over time I got to know them. 8 years of preaching to the same congregation, and the irony is in parishes, and any priest can tell you this. It's not that the 10 o'clock mass might have a very different uh, group of people from the 8 a.m. Mass or the 5 p.m. Mass. So it's not just that the parish has a culture, even particular masses have cultures. And getting
Yeah.
to know the particulars of this group of people is really important. It doesn't mean that it's not catering to their likes or dislikes. It's an awareness of them so as best to serve them,
Yeah.
and that's really because I want to be able to feed people. Again, this is never about me simply feeding them because I'm being fed. To preach well means to
Y-
have been fed well, you
Oh,
know.
yeah. What it points to is the fact that the homily isn't a standalone thing. It's part of the entire organic package of your ministry in this particular parish
Yes,
to these particular people. So the laity are going to be much more open to listening to you if they know you and like
absolutely.
you and have a relationship with you.
And if that's and this is absolutely true. One of the biggest mistakes younger clergy make, they pop out of the seminary, they're ordained, and they're going to ram their agenda down that new parish's throat, whether they like it or not. And
Yeah.
and you know what? they've lost their hearers in 2 weeks because there's no like you have to build a relationship trust with the people you serve. If you gain their trust, they'll listen to you, even telling them hard things, because they know it's coming from a place of love.
Yes.
If it's coming from a place of authority, this doesn't mean what it might have meant in 1925. You know,
So
trust
true.
trust for priests has to be earned. It's not automatic and it shouldn't be. In some ways, there's a good thing that we have to earn that because it makes us actually humble and gentle and docile toward the flock we're given to come to know and love
Yeah.
them. And then we can preach more effectively. But your point about the lay faithful, encouraging people to pray the scriptures. One of the great gifts that's come in the last 25 years to the church is you got Magnificat or this day and little missalettes that people now have access to and many use where they're actually praying, even if they don't get to mass, they're praying the readings of the church with the church. And that's such a
Yeah.
noble practice and a helpful practice.
Great resource too is the New Word on Fire Bibles
Yes.
that have all these commentaries laced
Mhm.
throughout the readings, beautiful pictures, and it's a great way for people to
Yeah.
prepare.
The New Ignatius Catholic Study Bible,
Oh,
it's enormous.
yes.
And it weighs about, I thought if St. Boniface had that, he'd still be alive because the hatchet wouldn't have been able to go through the whole thing. It's enormous. But
Yeah.
no, I remember I got mine not long ago. And it was sometime during Lent, I was preaching. There was a passage from Jeremiah that had a curiosity in it, I think. And I thought, I don't know what that means. So I just pulled that out, looked at it. It answered the question. I can't remember the particular point, but it answered exactly what I needed to know. It helped my preaching. Those resources, but the lay faithful, they have access to these too. They should be praying the scriptures.
Yeah,
Louis Boudier
absolutely.
says we should have so two registers of Lectio Divina going on in our life, every serious Christian. One, the daily readings, and another, ongoing sort of Lectio with a particular book or books in the course of the year. So I might be reading Isaiah during Advent, or one of the things I've done
Yeah.
this Easter season has been I've been doing Lectio with the whole book of Acts through the course of. Now we're hearing it at Mass, of course, but just carefully reading and praying through the whole thing. We need that to be fed, and we're circling back to the same texts, and yet we're deepened by that. As Gregory the Great says,
Yeah.
the scriptures grow with the reader. I had last summer when we had the cycle of the like 5 or 6 Sundays of John 6. The first weekend of that, I realized looking ahead, like, man, I'm going to be talking about the bread of life for 5 or 6 weeks. This is going to be challenging, and it was. But one of the things I suggested in the homily to the parish was that everyone should read John 6 once a week for the next 5 or 6 weeks. So they're circling back, reading it prayerfully, and then the next week, reading the same text prayerfully. And a number of people commented on how fruitful that was for their prayer, reflection, and understanding. But that we often think that we read something, we're done with it, we move on. But scripture isn't like that. We need the continue going back again and prayerfully in the language of the fathers, ruminating on it, like chewing cud. Like we keep going back to it,
Oh, yeah.
and it deepens our understanding of it. And people shouldn't be afraid of that because the problem is people read scripture like they read, the New York Times or Newsweek
Yeah.
or a blog. It's a totally different mode of reading, and so helping form people to read the scriptures the way the church reads them.
That's right. I
Pastor's
couldn't
work.
agree more. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, and I haven't gotten my copy of the Ignatius Study Bible. It was back ordered when
Yeah,
I ordered it, and
yeah,
then the
mine
order
too.
got
Mine just came with a couple. Well, it came during
yeah,
Lent. I remember that.
yeah, and so I can't wait to dig into that. Tell us a little bit because we're running out of time. What is the Martin program,
So
and how
John and
did?
Virginia Martin,
Go
who have
ahead.
now gone to the Lord, they're wonderful, wonderful, devout Catholic husband, wife, and parents. Endowed a program at Notre Dame to focus on preaching and also liturgics, but mostly homiletics. And so it involves, I mean, teaching homiletics to the seminarians of Holy Cross, but also MDiv students in lay formation. Obviously, they're not going to be necessarily doing preaching at Mass, but there's other modes of preaching. And so it's a course sequence of preaching homiletics. And then there's a biennial conference every other summer. This summer, we're having a conference in June. And we've got, I think, some very fine keynoters, including from my friend Father Robert Imbelli is one of our
Oh,
keynote.
Bob and Belly. Oh, I
And
love Father and
he's
Belly.
and other breakout speakers from and not all Catholic, which is great. We want to enrich ourselves. So I've got Jennifer McNutt from Wheaton is going to come and speak on Mary Magdalene in the scriptures. Nathan Eubank from Notre Dame is going to be there. Bishop Joseph Perry of Chicago is another keynoter. Father Patrick May Briscoe, Dominican,
Oh, I
is
just had dinner with
he,
him in Rome.
and
He's
he
great.
I gave him first communion. I've known him since he was a little kid, believe it or not.
Oh my
He was in my
gosh.
first parish. I used to, I remember when he was a little guy. He hasn't changed. He's delightful. But really really good people coming, and it's open to everyone. Mostly priests and deacons will come. So that's every other summer. I'm also looking at some new ventures to the way the program can partner with other preaching institutes and homiletic groups. It's my first year, so I'm new. I focused mostly this year on the conference because it's my first year. There's a couple other things I've got in the irons in the fire that I'm not able to talk about yet because they haven't been formalized or anything, but good things happening. And the theology department of Notre Dame is extraordinarily supportive. Father Khaled Anatolios, the chair, has been incredibly supportive and gracious. The colleagues in the department, my predecessor, Father Mike Connors, just wonderful people who have been very supportive and helpful in my work. And really, it's a joy to teach homiletics because I'm learning from the students. You know, when they preached, I had them preach. I find, for example, preaching Christmas and Easter the hardest things to preach for a couple of reasons. What could I, Micheal Heintz, possibly add regarding the sacred mysteries of the incarnation and birth of the Lord or the resurrection of the Lord that hasn't been said better by somebody else? You know, like
Yeah,
what I feel like I would much rather preach the 14th Sunday in Ordinary Time Year B than Christmas or Easter. The other problem with challenge with Christmas and Easter is you're not preaching to a congregation, you're preaching to daily Mass Catholics, Sunday Mass Catholics, occasional Catholics, once a year Catholics, and people who wandered in. And where do you aim? Who are you speaking to?
that's
Is
right.
it possible to speak to all of them? That's very difficult. So I find that daunting. So I had them, one of the things I had to do was preach Christmas. And I took away some nuggets from their approach. So I told them, I said, like, I might use that. That was really effective. So I learned from the students as well. So I
Yeah.
enjoy. So the way we do it is they preach almost weekly, and then we do a breakdown of each homiletic performance. Did it work? What was its commendations, recommendations, room for improvement? And what I love to see in the course of this last year was just the growth of the
Yeah.
homilies as they got more confident in preaching, they got better at it. The stiffness and the woodness even of the language went away, and some really beautiful things I heard from the students in my classes.
That's fantastic. Sounds like a great program. Wish I'd
I'm very blessed. And again, we're very
uh,
blessed by the Martin family for their support and ongoing support of the program. I'm very
very
blessed to
good.
be I'm blessed to be doing what I'm doing. I don't deserve any of this. I've got a wonderful parish. I've got a wonderful service at Notre Dame I can render. God's been very good to me, and I'm very happy to do all of it.
Well, thank you, Monsignor, for being here today. My first podcast since coming back from Rome. So
Well, welcome back. It's good to have you back. And
it's great to be back, and hopefully I'll see you in November
yes, please.
at the conference. But anyway, I know you have to run off to mass,
I do.
and
Give my
so
best to Carrie and pray for me, and I'll pray for you.
okay, will do. Thank you,
Thanks,
Monsignor.
Larry. God bless
Okay,
all.
bye bye.
Thanks.
Bye bye.